Let's talk about this new report from ProPublica with regard to Justice Clarence Thomas. Let's put this up on the screen. ProPublica has, of course, been doing a deep dive into the many luxury vacations that he has taken that have been footed by various wealthy individuals, Harlan Crow in particular, the funding of his mother's house, the payment of private school tuition, the offering of a generous loan which he maybe never had to repay for this luxury RV, etc. Well, now we are getting some insight into when all of these perks and all of this cash began to flow. They say here, a delicate matter, put the tear sheet back up on the screen, a delicate matter, Clarence Thomas's private complaints about money sparked fears that he would resign. What they track here is a conversation that he had in the early 2000s in which he expressed concern to a Republican lawmaker that he didn't make enough money and then he might have to resign from the court so that he could go and earn sufficient cash. Let me read to you this first quote that we pulled, put it up on the screen. After almost a decade on the court, Thomas had grown frustrated with his financial situation, according to friends. He'd recently started raising his young grandnephew, and Thomas's wife was soliciting advice on how to handle the new expenses. The month before, the justice had borrowed $267,000 from a friend to buy a high-end RV. That is a fancy RV. And by the way, like we said, we don't know if he ever actually paid back that money. Let's put the next piece up on the screen. Thomas brought up the prospect of justices resigning to Stearns, the Republican lawmaker. Worried, Stearns wrote a letter to Thomas after the flight where they were together, promising to look into a bill to raise the salaries of members of the Supreme Court. Put the next piece up. Congress never lifted the ban on speaking fees or gave the justices a major raise, but in the years that followed, as ProPublica has reported, Thomas accepted a stream of gifts from friends and acquaintances that appears to be unparalleled in the modern history of the Supreme Court. Some defrayed living expenses, large and small, private school tuition, vehicle batteries, tires. Other gifts from a coterie of ultra-rich men supplemented his lifestyle, such as free international vacations on the private jet and super yacht of Dallas real estate billionaire Harlan Crow. Just to give people a sense of, you know, how tough were things for Clarence Thomas and the other Supreme Court justices, which in fairness, many of the other Supreme Court justices, either they were already wealthy or their spouse was wealthy, so he was legitimately one of the quote-unquote poorest members of the court. But even in 2000, he was pulling in the Supreme Court salary. It's not like it was nothing. It was the inflation-adjusted equivalent of roughly $315,000. So those were the poverty wages that were forcing him to potentially resign from the court.
I see this with public officials all the time. And I think to really explain the phenomenon, you have to understand the water within they swim. Is on paper, they're important, but they make an upper middle class salary. Let's be real too, but it's a pretty good salary compared to vast majority of Americans. But the problem is that they're dining and they're hanging out all the time with millionaires, multimillionaires, and billionaires. And so your peer group becomes much richer than you are. And you start to ask yourself things like, hey, my buddy's got a lake house over here. My other friend's got a private jet. My other friend drives a Range Rover. I'm such an important guy. Why don't I get those things? But what they don't get is that you are welcome to any of that. You just have to leave. But if you left, then you'd have to compete in the marketplace and buy your own business, or at the very least sell out and be corrupt, and you wouldn't have the same level of power.
You don't have the power.
So they want to have it both ways. He wants to both be a household name and to be a Supreme Court justice and have all the accoutrement of the super rich. To which, again, I say, Clarence, resign. You can live a great life, man. By all accounts, he loves his RVs and the motorcycles and all that. He could quit today and he'd make 10 times more money, you know, just on the speaking circuit.
Instantly.
But he doesn't want to do it because he loves being on the Supreme Court. And this is what really annoys me about it, is these guys just simply have to accept that being in public service means taking a huge cut to your lifestyle. So be it. I don't even necessarily think it should be that way. I think that we could come up with all kinds of different systems, because my want is to remove corruption entirely from the system. But I also just have such a hard time, you know, even explaining it this way. not sitting here and saying $318,000 in adjusted income, that's a ton of money.
Yeah.
That's enough. You could make a mortgage, you could buy a house, and you could make your dumb, payment on a less higher end RV. You could afford a $100,000 RV. Why do you need a $267,000 RV? This is where I just think they want like absolute limitless of the resources of what they swim in. And I'm sorry, that's just not how America works. Or become rich first and then do it. That sounds like a tried and true strategy too.
There are a lot of middle class people out there who are able to afford a, reasonably priced RV.
And this is not even
Clarence
middle class.
Thomas, $315,000. Surely you would have been able to, pursue your passions in that regard. I thought some of the quotes in this piece were remarkable. This Congressman, Florida Representative Cliff Stearns, who they describe as a vocal conservative who at that time in 2000 had been in Congress for 11 years and occasionally socialized with Justice Thomas. He said that in an interview with ProPublica about this exchange where Thomas is saying, I might resign from the court because I'm just not making enough cash. He said, quote, his importance as a conservative was paramount. We wanted to make sure he felt comfortable in his job and was being paid properly. I mean, that's as much a direct acknowledgement of this whole scheme as you could possibly get. At the same time, they say during his second decade on the court, after this conversation, Thomas's financial situation appears to have markedly improved with the help of his wealthy benefactors. I added that part in. In 2003, he received the first payments of a $1.5 million advance for his memoir. That was a record-breaking sum for justices at the time. This is interesting to me. Ginny Thomas, his wife, who had been a congressional staffer, was by then working at the Heritage Foundation and was paid a salary in the low six figures. So his wife gets a nice gig as well, paying her well. He's getting these dozens of expensive gifts, most of which were never reported to the public. And so it seems like this circle of conservative donors, in order to ensure that he, and apparently the other justice they were concerned about at the time was Scalia, didn't resign and stayed on the court, because Clarence Thomas indicated like, oh, it's not just me, it may be also at least one other justice who would resign, and Scalia was the other quote unquote least wealthy of the justices who were on the court. And so they ramped up their gifting, which all flew under the radar. And, it also exposes the distance between public expectations for quote-unquote public servants and the schemes that they, the ethical schemes that they actually operate in. I mean, you still have the court really blocking any sort of scrutiny, any sort of code of conduct that would have any teeth. That's very different from the entire rest of the federal judiciary. And I do think at its core, it reminds me of like Bob McDonnell. Very similar story where, he and his wife were accepting all of these luxury gifts from people who had business with the state and stood to benefit from state policy. And lo and behold, that goes to he's found guilty of corruption. It goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, nah, we don't think that's corruption. Interesting that they would side with him on that case, isn't it?
It's a problem for them. It really is. And my only hope is that these stories are setting a standard, at least in the federal judiciary, who are those who are, future Supreme Court nominees, where you have to learn to, at the very least, even if none of this is illegal, it's like, you don't want to deal with this in all these stories. This will be one of probably the most enduring things that people remember about Clarence Thomas was Anita Hill, and now this. And I think, why would you want to tar your legacy that way? It's just not something that you would want to deal with. So at least let shame be a part of the guiding thing, although I generally think most of these people are too shameless to ever care.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.